Hi folks, how's it going? You're very welcome to another Saturday session of Junior Cycle History here at ExamRevision.ie. So in this lesson, we are going to examine patterns of change, particularly focusing on health and medicine. Okay, so as part of your Junior Cycle History course, you must illustrate patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society, such as crime and punishment, food and drink, work and leisure, fashion and appearance, or health and medicine. So you have to do one of these here, and we're going to do health and medicine. Okay, and the key thing is that you can show how health and medicine has developed and changed over different time periods. Okay, so we're going to look at health and medicine over 3 distinct time periods today, and then we're going to look at a sample question and answer as to what this should look like when you go to answer it. So here's a sample question that may come up on your Junior Cycle History exam. So part A, as part of your Junior Cycle History course, you studied patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society. Name the theme you studied. So name the theme you studied. So this tells us, okay, that we must know the theme we studied, okay, as in know the name of it, okay? So there was fashion and appearance, crime and punishment, health and medicine, etc. So ours was obviously health and medicine. So you have to know the name of your theme. Okay, so health and medicine, health and medicine, health and medicine. All right. So for simply stating health and medicine, we'll get 3 marks. Okay. Then we must explain 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to the theme you studied. Okay, so we need to examine 3 ways that health and medicine has developed over time in relation to our theme. Okay, so basically really simple, pick 3 medical advances. All right, and we talk about these in our answer. Now, like the reason why I would always do health and medicine is because you will have covered health and medicine in a lot of the topics you do on the Junior Cycle History course. For example, when you did life and death in medieval times, you will have talked about the Black Death, the plague, and maybe some of the really bad, ineffective medieval cures. When you went on to Renaissance medicine, you would have spoken a little bit more about Renaissance medicine. Okay, you may have spoken about Roman medicine, you know, I suppose the theories of Galen, things like that. Okay, so you will have covered a lot of these as you have covered your Junior Cycle History course, and it's just a case of going through this topic now and I suppose putting all this information that you already know together to form a sample answer. So this question was worth 18 marks in total, okay? And how it works is each valid, relevant, and developed point is worth 3 marks. So if you basically, make a statement and develop it, you'll get 3 marks. If you, give us, I suppose give a real detailed piece of information and develop it, or give someone's name, a date, you'll get 3 marks, okay? So you need to basically make 6 key points in total and develop them to be guaranteed full marks here. So like we need to talk about 3, developments in health and medicine. So that means maybe you're going to make at least 2 or 3 points on each one, okay? To be guaranteed getting close to your full 18 marks here on this question, okay? So anyway, we're now going to jump into health and medicine through time and look at how it's developed, all right? And as we go, some of this will probably be familiar to you. You probably would have done a lot of this, as I said, as you covered earlier topics in the course, such as life and death in medieval times, the Roman Empire, the Renaissance, etc., etc. So when we think back to medieval life, a lot of the cures during the Middle Ages were really ineffective, and a lot of the cures kind of relied on like pure superstition, okay? So for example, bleeding was a big thing. So during medieval times, a lot of people believed that diseases were carried in the bloodstream. So the idea was that they would cut open arteries and veins and basically drain so-called bad blood out of the body, okay? There's other mad stuff as well. For example, prayer. Like a lot of people relied on prayer as a form of cure because they just didn't know. They didn't really know what ways to cure people. Okay. Now this began to change as he kind of moved into the Renaissance, into the kind of 14 and 1500s. So the Renaissance, I suppose, the kind of age of enlightenment, the rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman ideas. This spurned I suppose a great advance and a lot of developments in all aspects of life: technology, art, science, healthcare, you name it. So healthcare, medicine advanced greatly during the Renaissance period. So some of the foundations of our current medicine were made during the Renaissance. So the first major thing we're going to talk about is Andreas Vesalius. Okay, Belgian doctor Andreas Vesalius dissected bodies. Okay, so he dissected bodies, and he disproved many of the old ideas of the Greeks and Romans. So, for example, Galen, a Greek doctor, a lot of the Romans followed Galen's ideas. Now, Galen did make a few advances, but he made a lot of mistakes as well. Okay, but it wasn't until Andreas Vesalius began dissecting bodies that we really began to learn. Okay, Vesalius published his ideas in a book called On the Fabric of the Human Body. So it's very important we know that, On the Fabric of the Human Body, in 1543. All right. So Vesalius was one of the first Renaissance doctors to make major, I suppose, leaps when it comes to our understanding of human body. Okay. Now, a second man during the Renaissance was an English doctor called William Harvey. Okay. And William Harvey discovered that blood circulated around the body. Okay. So in medieval times, they used to believe that blood was made, that kind of it circulated around the body and then went back into your liver, and it just kind of disappeared. Okay. Whereas Harvey discovered blood circulated around the body. He published his findings in 1628 in a book called On the Motion of the Heart and Blood in Animals. So on the movement of the heart and blood in animals. So really interesting diagram here. So this is basically how Harvey discovered that blood circulated around the body. He got someone to hold a pole. He tied a very tight rope around her arm, and he was able to see that the tight rope prevented blood flow from coming back in towards the body. And he was able to see that this means that blood must circulate around the body. Okay, blood circulates around the body, as this very tight noose I have on this person's arm is preventing blood flow. Okay, so there are our first two Renaissance men, Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey. A third Renaissance doctor we know is a guy called Ambroise Paré. And Ambroise Paré made great discoveries in surgery in the 1500s. Okay, so Paré was he was a doctor that was, I suppose, he was a medical doctor in the military. All right, so like, talk about it, I suppose, a good place to learn. So soldiers, who would come back from battle, who were wounded, might have had limbs hanging off. Paré would have been a surgeon, and it was his job to basically, I suppose, save these soldiers' lives. And through working in these conditions, he made a lot of discoveries. Okay, and one of his discoveries in amputation saved many lives. So back then, think of the nature of warfare back then. A lot of swords, spears, hand-to-hand combat. So a lot of people a lot of soldiers who survived battle came back with badly damaged limbs. And Paré would have spent a lot of his time, I suppose, dissecting and amputating limbs. Okay, so chopping off a bad limb. And Paré discovered that if he chose an amputation site that was well above the infected area, infections and gangrene were less likely to spread. Okay, so I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Say, for example, I badly damage my hand in battle. Okay, and I go back to the medical tent after the battle, and the doctor needs to amputate my hand. Previously, before Paré, the doctor would want to save as much of my arm as possible, so the doctor would probably just amputate my hand right at the wrist. Okay, now Paré discovered that this was no good, because yes, you're saving more of the person's arm, but gangrene is going to spread right above the arm and kill the person. So Paré discovered that you must amputate much closer to, say, the shoulder blade. Okay, basically take off most of the arm, because this is safer, and it means there's a much less of a chance that gangrene and other infections would spread and eventually kill the person. Okay, so Andreas Vesalius, William Harvey, and Ambroise Paré, these men made great advances in Renaissance medicine in a number of different ways. Okay, guys, so we finished looking at health and medicine in Renaissance society. We're now moving ahead a couple of hundred years to the industrial society. Now, what I mean by industrial society is basically life in towns and cities after the Industrial Revolution. So kind of like the late 17 to, early to late 1800s. Okay, so the late 1700s into the 1800s. So basically, if we think back to the Industrial Revolution, now you probably wouldn't have actually done this, but the Industrial Revolution was basically a time of great advances in industry and agriculture. A lot of big inventions, for example, the steam engine, and these meant that there was a huge increase in industry and coal production in Britain and then later throughout Europe. And what this meant is that lots and lots of people quickly moved into towns and cities because basically that's where all the jobs were. There was loads of new factories popping up and there was loads of jobs available. So people, who used to live on the land, farmers struggling to make a living, would have moved to towns and cities in an effort to get work. And the towns and cities eventually became really cramped and dirty, unsanitary places. And what did you have? Well, naturally enough, you had the spread of disease very quickly. Now, just on a side note to that, guys, Ireland at this time wouldn't have experienced the Industrial Revolution. We were still very much an agricultural society. Most Irish people in the 1800s were poor farmers who lived off the land and probably survived off spuds. And then that's obviously when the famine hit, this would have devastating consequences for us. But in Britain and many other parts of Europe, industrial society, places became very industrial. Okay, so smallpox became a disease that was rampant in these new towns: London, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. And smallpox spread because in the Industrial Revolution, people often lived in cramped, poorly built housing where disease spread rapidly. So if you suppose you think about it, like we obviously have lived through the coronavirus, one of the ways of fighting the COVID was, I suppose, social distancing. Okay, making sure you're 2 meters apart from the person next to you. This was impossible in industrial society when maybe you had a 2-bedroom house with an entire family in it. Okay, so smallpox spread rapidly, and this is what smallpox will do to you. You'll be covered in spots and boils, really unsightly disease to get. And a man called Edward Jenner, okay, developed the first vaccine for smallpox. And basically he did this by, so there was a cows had their own version of smallpox, but it was called cowpox. So Jenner he took some of the cowpox out of a cow and he basically injected it into people. Okay, and this worked to combat smallpox. And he eventually opened a vaccination clinic. Okay, so the first vaccination clinic opened in the mid-1800s, and by 1452, smallpox vaccinations were made compulsory in London. All right, and throughout all of England. So it's a bit like now, during COVID, a lot of the places you needed a COVID cert to get into them. Most bars and restaurants, etc. Most public places, really. That was the same back in the 1850s. You needed to get your smallpox vaccine. Otherwise, maybe you couldn't go to work. Okay, so very, very big development, the smallpox vaccine. And again, it came from basically using a strain of cowpox. So just an interesting poster here. So I suppose, when the COVID vaccines were rolled out, there was opposition to them. People were kind of against them. There was, I suppose, you might refer to people as anti-vaxxers or whatever. People were against the smallpox vaccine, okay, in the 1800s. So this is an anti-smallpox vaccine, okay, poster. And you can see here, look, so we know that Edward Jenner here is injecting this lady with a smallpox vaccine. Now, where does that smallpox vaccine originate from? It originates from a strain of cowpox. So people believe that stuff like this would start happening. You would start turning into a cow. You might grow horns. A cow might come out your backside, okay? It's just like a funny anti-smallpox vaccination poster from the time, from the mid-1800s, okay? Because people were skeptical. I suppose, fair enough. You're telling people, I'm going to cure your smallpox by injecting you with a strain of cowpox. So people obviously were skeptical. and we're worried about this, but it did work, and it kind of eradicated smallpox eventually. So the second development in health and medicine in industrial society we'll look at is Louis Pasteur and his rabies vaccine. Okay, so Louis Pasteur was the first man to discover that germs cause diseases. Now we might think now that's common sense. Well, it is to us, but in the 1800s it wasn't common sense. So you can see how disease spread so rapidly, because people, like, there could have been open sewers right beside where people were living, and people didn't realize that those open sewers would cause disease. All right, so Louis Pasteur was the first man to discover that germs cause disease, okay? And with this knowledge, Louis Pasteur developed the very first rabies vaccine in 1885. So rabies was very often contracted by maybe getting bitten from a dog, for example. And again, people didn't know where rabies came from. But Louis Pasteur discovered that rabies was caused by germs, all right? So germs getting into an infected cut. And basically, he done a lot of testing on rabbits. That's why I have an image here of him holding rabbits. Okay, now you might think that's a bit unfortunate or a bit mean, testing on cute rabbits, but that's just the way it was. Okay, and Pasteur's rabies vaccine was, I suppose, revolutionary, and it did gradually totally eradicate the disease. Okay, so it was very, very, very important for eradicating the rabies disease. Now, you might have heard of the term before, pasteurization. Okay, so pasteurization. So, like, for example, when you buy milk, okay, in your local shop or supermarket, before, like, that milk doesn't just come straight from the cow into a milk carton and it's on the shelf. That milk has to be what's called pasteurized. So pasteurized is a process where it gets rid of any excess germs and diseases that may be in the milk to make it safe for the consumer to drink. Pasteurization was invented by this man as well, Louis Pasteur, and it's named after him, pasteurization. Okay, the cleaning of cow's milk or any animal's milk before, to make it fit for human consumption, I suppose. So there was further advances in industrial society, and these were advances in surgery. Okay, so before the 19th century, surgeons had to rush through procedures as patients were usually conscious. Okay, so imagine that you're getting an operation and you're awake during it. So just look at this poor gentleman here on the left-hand side. He's getting a surgical procedure done to him, and you'll notice he is totally awake. He's clearly in a bit of discomfort and pain, and yes, he's being held down by a number of men. Okay, so that's how surgery was done before the Industrial Revolution. You'll also notice here the tools that are being used. So it looks like there is a large tweezers, a sharp knife, what looks like a hacksaw, and a couple of other blades. So, like, the tools that are being used as well to carry out surgery were more like the tools you'd see maybe in a carpenter's workshop. Okay, so surgery at the time was very dangerous and very risky. And surgery often worsened the conditions of patients. Again, surgeons wore no masks, they wore no gowns or no gloves. And they also did not wash their hands between surgeries. So, like, they would often go from one patient to the next without washing their hands, and it would lead to very high death rates. Okay, so, like, people would often if you got surgery, you're going to die because of the surgery. The surgery actually worsened your condition. All right, so there's big advances made in surgery during the 19th century that we're going to look at now. So first of all, the first anesthetic was used, and this was called chloroform. Okay, and anesthetics were painkillers. So the anesthetic, if you go to get surgery now, you're put under a general anesthetic that puts you asleep. Okay, now they wouldn't have been quite as effective back then, but they would have definitely helped. Okay, so an anesthetic was a painkiller for patients. So, for example, here, this gentleman here has an anesthetic. It's a localized anesthetic, so it would maybe numb his leg, okay, and he can't feel the pain. And we can see a nurse here trying to distract him to keep him from looking at what the doctors are doing to him. Okay, so the first anesthetic, chloroform, was developed during the Industrial Revolution. Second development was a development in antiseptic. So an antiseptic is basically used for cleaning and creating sterile operating theaters. Okay, and the first antiseptic was called carbolic spray, and it created a sterile operating theater. It's basically a clean operating theater that was free of disease. Like prior to this, you'd be going to, you'd be going to lie on an operating bed, and there'd be blood on it from the previous patient. Okay, again, they just didn't have a good understanding of how germs and diseases spread. Okay, so these developments, anesthetics such as chloroform, antiseptics such as carbolic spray, resulted in a big decline in the death rate among patients, a huge decline in the death rate among patients in industrial society. Okay, so we've looked at health and medicine and developments through the Renaissance. So you'll think back your Andreas Vesalius, your William Harvey, your Ambroise Paré, Louis Pasteur, Edward Jenner. So now we're coming more into the 20th century. Okay, and a lot of big developments are made in the 20th century. So in the early 20th century, like, again, a lot of this to us is like, it makes kind of, it's stuff that we would never have to think of, because we take a lot of things for granted. For example, having a balanced diet, having good access to all different types of food, fruit and veg easily, local shop in our fridge. This was not the case in the early 20th century. So in the early 20th century, diseases such as scurvy and beriberi were common. Okay, and they're caused by a lack of vitamins that people didn't get through diet. So like scurvy now, you'd never get scurvy now in the developed world. Scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Okay, and beriberi caused by a lack of other vitamins. So people just didn't have access to fruit and veg. Okay, I suppose you think about it, like a lot of and if you've looked at my video on developments in technology, we look at the airplane, how the airplane and steam powered boats would have contributed to trade, which meant that a lot of different fruits and veggies from around the world were now more accessible. Okay, this was not the case really in the early 20th century. So this would have meant that, like the only fruit and veg you might be able to get is the stuff you can grow in your garden, or the stuff that was grown down the road. So that meant it was very limited. Okay, and it meant that people didn't get a lot of the required nutrients and vitamins they needed. And this is where this man here, Dr. Forrest C. Shackley, came in. And he created the first multivitamins in 1915. So here are Shackley's Vitalized Minerals. Okay, so these are basically just literally multivitamin tablets. Okay, tablets that contain many vitamins that you could take 1 or 2 a day, or 1 or 2 in the morning, and this would give you vitamins that you're not going to get through your diet. So what did these do? Well, they aided growth, development, and they improved immune systems. Okay, so again, basic things. This is a very, for us, it's a basic thing, but back then, this is revolutionary. And these would help to eradicate diseases. Okay, so they totally eradicated diseases like smallpox. So we did mention Edward Jenner had a smallpox vaccine, but it was still floating around the place. And smallpox, like, it's very similar with COVID. Like, if you've got a poor immune system, it's going to affect you badly and affect you worse. Okay, so smallpox was the same. If you had a poor immune system, if you had a lack of certain vitamins, it was going to affect you worse than say, someone who had a stronger immune system. So that's why these multivitamins were vital. So a second development of, in the 20th century in health and medicine was the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin was vital in basically destroying bacterial infections. And it was discovered in 1928 by this man here, Alexander Fleming. You probably heard of his name before, or it might ring a bell. So he is the man behind penicillin. And this played a huge role in saving the lives of many people. And again, where did it play the biggest role? In warfare. So similar to our Renaissance surgeon, Ambroise Paré, whose idea behind amputating well above the infected or injured site prevented the spread of gangrene and diseases. Penicillin would greatly reduce the amount of men who died in warfare. Okay, so penicillin killed bacterial infections before they could spread to other parts of the body, and it played a major role in saving the lives of wounded soldiers in World War II. So it's interesting, like, if you look at the death toll from the First World War, so, First World War, 1914 to 18, a lot more soldiers would have died from bacterial infections, from the likes of gangrene and stuff, because penicillin hadn't been invented or discovered then. But in the Second World War, a lot of wounds and infections were much more treatable. And penicillin is an antibiotic. So again, you've probably heard that term before, antibiotic. So penicillin is now the most widely used antibiotic in the world. So like basically many antibiotics contain penicillin now because it's so effective in killing bacterial infections and preventing them from spreading to other parts of the body. And it saved many, many lives. Okay, many, many lives. Going into the 20th century, okay, so later in the 20th century, doctors discovered chemotherapy, okay, and radiotherapy. So chemotherapy and radiotherapy are cancerous treatments, okay? They're anti-cancer drugs. And basically how they work is you pump these into the bloodstream and they fight and attack cancerous cells in the human body. And these were massive developments. Like prior to this, if you got cancer, like there was no real cure as such. Unfortunately, you would probably eventually die from it. Okay, so chemotherapy was vital, and it was developed. Chemotherapy kind of was developed in a number of different nations by a number of different doctors. Okay, because it was a very, very big. There was a big need for it, I suppose. Like cancer affected people worldwide. Okay, so in the 20th century, doctors began developing cancer treatments such as chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Chemotherapy was first used in 1942. Okay, and this was a huge development because in the past, people who got cancer would die from it. So people who got cancer would simply die from it. Like you couldn't really survive it, unfortunately. It would eventually kill you. Okay, now another big treatment or another big development that also saved many, many lives is our next one, and it's magnetic radio. Magnetic resonance imaging, okay, MRI machines. And MRI machines were first invented on the 3rd of July, 1977. Okay, now MRI machines, you may have gotten an MRI before. Very, very important and significant pieces of equipment. So MRI machines basically gave doctors a really, really good chance and ability of basically diagnosing ailments. Okay, before this, it was kind of guesswork. If you had a pain somewhere, a lot of it was, I think it could be this or I think it could be that. Whereas an MRI could diagnose exactly what was wrong with people. So MRI machines give doctors the ability to see tissues, ligaments, bones, and the human brain. Okay, MRIs have allowed doctors to easily diagnose patients, meaning they have a greater chance of being cured. So, for example, like if you had cancer, would be a big one. Okay, so if you had cancer, an MRI machine could allow a doctor to pick up cancer early. Okay, and pick it up early, and I suppose meaning that person could get the required treatment, whether it be radiotherapy or chemotherapy, as early as possible. Okay, so MRI machines were a vital invention, and again would have saved many, many lives. So now, folks, we're going to go through a sample answer. So a potential question that can be asked is the 18-mark question that we looked at the beginning. So that was split up into 2 parts. So I suppose it's actually more of a 21-mark question. So part A is worth your 3 marks, and part B is worth 18 marks. So part A, as part of your junior cycle history course, you studied patterns of change across different time periods in a chosen theme relating to life and society. Name the theme you studied, health and medicine. So guys, this question will be worded in this way, in that you will need to know the name of the theme you studied, health and medicine. So, a lot of the time, like, students, they might, for example, they could prepare a sample answer on what we've just done on developments in Renaissance, industrial, and 20th century healthcare. But they actually forget to properly know the name of that theory or that theme, and they might say, healthcare. That's wrong. It has to be health and medicine, or you don't get your 3 marks. So an easy 3 marks to lose is what I'd say there. So make sure you studied health and medicine. Okay, now It may say it on the exam paper somewhere, but it probably won't. So make sure you know health and medicine. So explain 3 changes or developments that took place in relation to the theme you studied. So we're going to talk about developments in our 3 different time periods, okay? So during the Renaissance, doctors such as Andreas Vesalius dissected human bodies so they could get a better understanding of anatomy, okay? Vesalius would publish his findings in On the Fabric of the Human Body. Other doctors, such as William Harvey, discovered that blood circulated around the body. His findings were published in 1628 in On the Motion of the Heart and Blood in Animals. So the first part of this answer, we focus on health and medicine in Renaissance society. Now, we've put in more than enough there, more than enough. Okay, so we talked about 2 doctors, okay, and 2 of their discoveries. So very, very good start to this answer here. Okay, so we're going to talk about more changes. We're going to talk about our second group of changes that took place during during industrial society. So apologies, not industrial society, 20th century. So in the 20th century, many medical advances were made. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, the first ever antibiotic. Penicillin worked by killing bacterial infections before they could spread to other parts of the body. Penicillin played a major role in saving the lives of wounded soldiers in World War II. And to date, it is the most widely used antibiotic in the world. So, guys, we've put loads of really good information in here so far. So we've kind of already spoken about 3 developments already, because we did speak about William Harvey, Andreas Vesalius, and Alexander Fleming. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a 4th as well, just so we have a good bank of knowledge here to make sure we're hitting our 18 marks. Okay, but so far we've more than mentioned enough on health and medicine and developments in health and medicine. So finally, what I'm going to throw in here is cancer treatment. So in the 20th century, cancer treatments such as chemotherapy and radiotherapy were developed. Chemotherapy was first used to treat cancerous tumors in 1942. Before the development of these treatments, most people who developed cancer had no chance of being cured. So again, really highlights the how important chemo and radiotherapy were. Now, guys, that is a perfect full marks answer there, 18 marks, okay? We've talked about actually 4 developments in health and medicine there, okay? So what you could do, guys, to practice, you'll notice I left out health and medicine in industrial society. So you could, if you want, you could practice writing your own sample answer on health and medicine in industrial society, and health and medicine, and you could use 1 from Renaissance, 2 from industrial society, and 1 from the 20th century. Okay, absolutely. All right, and again, use this sample answer as a guide to help you. If you go back to some of the early slides, we did have examples of the marking scheme there as well. So 18 marks, 3 points per valid relative point. So if you make your statement and you develop it, you get your 3 marks. Okay, so if you can do that 6 times over the course of your answer, you're going to get your full 18 marks. Okay, guys, that's it for this Saturday session here at ExamRevision.ie. Really hope it was beneficial to you, and we hope you look forward to the next video, which will be along shortly. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for tuning in. Have a good one.